That's right there.
Scott's right. And do we have a presentation?
Yes.
Is it already in here?
Hey, Scott. Scott, do you have your presentation on here?
Yeah, it's on there.
Yeah.
Hopefully. Otherwise, I got it in my pocket.
What's
It's
it?
on there.
This deer habitat?
All right, while they're getting us going, I was going to introduce Scott. He's
Yeah,
going to be
yes.
doing restoration. of
No.
urban
Okay.
habitat. So Scott is the Alaska Regional Conservation Coordinator for the Mule Deer Foundation. He's based in Juneau. And he's the organization's first full-time position in Alaska. So, Forest Service.
Okay, so you can forward,
We're just
this is the
beginning.
black screen.
The MDF is expanding their emphasis
And
on
the ones are
black-tailed
funny.
deer conservation, and
Thank you.
working with federal, state, and tribal agencies as well as other organizations to improve Sitka black-tailed deer habitat throughout the Northeast landscape. Scott, together with Jim Beischel, Alaska Regional, who joined MDF as a consultant in 2022, pick up the Alaska team working to build partnerships and support for landscape level collaborative conservation of Sitka black-tailed deer and habitat in Alaska. So with that, I'll let Scott take over.
Yep. Thank you all for having me talk today. Just a little bit of background about myself. I've been doing wildlife research in Alaska for about the past 10 years out of the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I did my bachelor's, master's, and PhD all under the supervision of Todd Brinkman up there, who's done research in Southeast on deer for about the past 15 years or so. So I just wrapped up a PhD last year and took this position for the Mule Deer Foundation in December. So about 6 months in Southeast. So excited to learn a new system. And my past research was a lot in the Arctic. So going from a completely treeless environment to now being in the forest is a nice change and presents new challenges and exciting opportunities. So click on the screen. There we go. Okay. So just general background here, Sitka black-tailed deer. So Sitka black-tailed deer are a subspecies of mule deer. Mule deer here are represented in light gray. So this is western deer. To the south, northwest in kind of yellowish is Columbian black-tailed deer. So they're coastal south part of British Columbia, Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. And then in the north, north coastal portion of British Columbia and then Southeast Alaska, we have Sitka black-tailed deer. So Sitka black-tailed deer are native to Southeast Alaska and northern BC. There have been transplant populations in Yakutat, Prince William Sound, and Kodiak and Afognak Islands that have established populations there now. But for generally speaking, we're talking about Southeast Alaska for this presentation. So black-tailed deer here in Southeast are the most sought after big game species. They support abundant subsistence and recreational harvest opportunities in local communities. And just as an example of that, can you raise your hand if you hunt or consume deer on a regular annual basis? So if you look around the room, we have the majority of people participating in using this resource. So it's vitally important to these communities. And so you might be asking, why is the Mule Deer Foundation coming into Alaska focusing on black-tailed deer? Well, like I mentioned before, Sitka black-tailed deer are a subspecies of mule deer, so that kind of puts it under our umbrella. And also, our mission statement is to ensure the conservation of mule deer, black-tailed deer, and their habitat. So we're the only kind of nonprofit wildlife organization that's dedicated to Western deer in the country. So that's the role we're trying to fill. There are some mule deer in Alaska, interior Alaska, some in north and southeast. But in terms of what we'll be focusing on as an organization in Alaska, it's going to be almost primarily or almost exclusively focused on black-tailed deer in Southeast Alaska. So just a brief overview of the talk I'm going to be presenting. So we're going to focus on deer, obviously, but then also the relationship between hunters and other resource users and landscape. So on the left here, we have Jim Beischel, who came on as a consultant for the Mule Deer Foundation in 2022 after his retirement with the Forest Service. So he kind of got the ball rolling for us here in Alaska, and then I just came on 6 months ago. And we're working on transitioning those roles currently. But so we're talking about this system with deer, people, primarily hunters, and land management, and how those systems are working together and how they're influenced by one another. And then also another component that we build into the system is the environment or weather. And when we're talking about deer biology, really what we're focused on here is winter severity. So how that influences these different components to this system and how they all have feedback loops and influence one another. So this is kind of the general basis of what we'll cover in the talk today. And if you're not a fan of animations, I apologize, because pretty much the rest of the talk is about hypothetical animations, about, you know, scenarios in which deer and people and landscapes and weather interact. So I borrowed some of these slides from Todd Brinkman and then expanded them based on kind of the things I wanted to cover today. So here we have an example of an old growth forest. We have mixed age stands and some understory vegetation and deer scattered throughout this range. Starting in the 1980s or so, you know, we had a large scale industrial timber harvest. And to do so, we punched in roads into new areas and clear cut forest. By doing so, we created this open forest landscape where sunlight could reach the forest floor and started producing high levels of vegetation in this open clear cut. And this high level of forage production facilitated more use of deer in this landscape and high deer populations. So if you were a hunter back in the 70s, maybe 60s, maybe in the 80s, you experienced excellent hunting opportunities. So represented here by our little friend Elmer Fudd. During this time, after these roads were created and these clear cuts were made, these also provided access for hunters to utilize new hunting areas on the landscape. And these new hunting areas were really prime hunting habitat. So when we talk about deer habitat and hunting habitat, those things kind of differ, and we'll go over some examples of how that might be. But in this case, in these open clear cuts, there's a lot of deer because of this new forage regeneration, and it's open so people can see them really well. So this creates ideal hunting conditions. And so, you know, during this early successional phase, there's good hunting opportunity and everybody's doing well. Well, fast forward a little bit of time, and as that stand regenerates and you know, higher vegetation comes in, trees start to become established, the hunters can no longer see these deer in these, you know, early successional phase second growth stands. And so we see declining hunter satisfaction or reduced use in these stands because they're not seeing these deer. And so picking up from here, here we have on the left, younger second growth stand, and on the right, you have an old growth stand. And as that second growth stand matures and those canopies start to close in, what happens is sunlight can't reach the forest floor and it can't support this understory vegetation. So that vegetation dies off, which reduces forage for deer. Because of that, deer are forced to move into areas where there is forage available. So in this case, we're moving deer into this old growth stand. But as most people know, the landscape cannot support an unlimited number of deer. And as these deer transition into other areas, there's a possibility that these areas can't sustain the numbers of deer that are in that area. So as an overall landscape perspective, we have a reduced carrying capacity in this system. The potential solutions to this, and I don't know why these yellow lines are here, but they don't seem to be impeding anything, so we'll live with it. Maybe it's some like sun rays or something. But the potential solution here is to create forest gaps in the canopy. So that might be through thinning or gap treatments or pruning or whatever treatment you might use. But the idea is to create gaps in the canopy to allow sunlight to reach the forest floor, which then promotes bigger trees because they have less competition, and forage growth on the forest floor. And with that, we have a return of deer and everybody's happy. We have increased habitat and restored habitat across the landscape. So this is kind of the ideal scenario of what we're aiming for. Now, that was kind of the interaction between deer, hunters, and forestry or land management. But now just to focus specifically on deer and how they're using this landscape throughout the year. So this is an excellent graphic depicting the typical or an example of deer's behavior or movement throughout a course of a year. Before I get into this though, we'll mention that there are what we call resident deer and migratory deer. So resident deer are ones that use the same home range over the course of a year, where migratory deer might have distinct summer and winter ranges. So this is a depiction of one that might be a migratory deer. So beginning where life starts, we're going to start with fawning here in late May and early June, where does are giving birth and they're in search of new plant growth as spring is here, and new plant growth to support lactation and start putting on that fat reserve for the summer. And as the spring progresses into late June and we get a receding snow line, deer start to move up in elevation following that new exposure of forage. So a common term used to describe this is surfing the green wave. So as new habitat becomes exposed by a receding snow line, we have deer moving up in elevation, which leads them to their summer range in high alpine areas, typically by late June, early July. So in these alpine areas, we have abundant forage, potentially reduced predation because bears during this time are probably focused in lower elevations during the salmon runs. And good conditions for putting on fat and eating a lot of food. But as summer nears an end and we start returning to colder temperatures, as that first frost in the alpine happens and kills off some of the vegetation, and as snow starts to accumulate and those high elevation slopes, deer start getting pushed down in elevation. So now we're kind of coming down slope now, following the snowpack as those deer get follow what forage is available. Then moving into the rut, which is typically in late October throughout November, sometimes into December, we have high movement, and there can be deer kind of across the landscape, not typically up in the alpine where there's not, at this time, quite a bit of snow accumulation in most areas. But generally, bucks are chasing does around, trying to breed. So there's high movement, and this is typically when bucks will lose a lot of their fat reserves that they put on during the summer because they're busy trying to get some. So then moving on to winter. So now deer have reached their winter range where they spend from December to March or so during the snowy months. And depending on snow load and snow conditions, there can be pretty significant restricted movement depending on the forest stand conditions and how much snow you've received and things like that. But generally, if snow is above the knee height or so, especially if it's up into the brisket of the deer, that can require huge energetic costs to move through that snow. And so movement is pretty much impeded during high snow years on the winter range. And then lastly here, during spring snowmelt, we reset the cycle as deer start to find new forage as the snow begins to recede. So kind of deer movement ecology 101. To put that into perspective, a lot of that movement was drove by winter and snow accumulation. So here's returning to our example here. We have a young second growth stand on the left. We have a recent clear cut in the middle and an old growth stand on the right, just as a hypothetical scenario. But in winter, when snow falls, these clear cuts don't offer any snow interception. So this is where the greatest snow accumulation occurs. The second growth stand and the old growth stand both have some canopy cover and can intercept that snow, so there's less accumulation on the ground where deer can move in and out of. So in this hypothetical scenario, there are outcomes. Either deer can move in or be pushed into the second growth stands. However, if they're in stem exclusion phase and there's limited forage in that stand and they potentially get stuck there, they can end up dying. And you can sometimes in the winter, in a harsh winter, see kind of groups of deer, big winter kill in the stem excluded stands where deer have kind of been pushed and concentrated. The other potential outcome is deer move into these old growth stands where there is some forage availability, but like we discussed before, these stands can only support a certain number of deer for a certain amount of time. And depending on how long they're in there, they can eat themselves out of house and home, and again, reduce the overall carrying capacity of this landscape. So just to summarize kind of all of that into one infographic, this was work done by Megan Para, who was a graduate student in Todd Brinken's lab, to kind of summarize the research that he had done over the past 15 years or so. So to break this down, on the top, we have time. So on the left, we have 0 to 12 years after clear cut. In the middle left, we have 12 to 25 years after clear cut as that stand begins to regenerate. Middle right, we have 25 to 120 years after clear cut. So this is when that stand has reached the stem exclusion phase. And on the right, after a couple hundred years, you might get into this old growth characteristics. On the left of these figures is canopy cover. So high values there with the black triangle is an open canopy, and on the bottom is closed canopy. The bottom kind of rainbow colored bar is forage quality or forage availability. And then on the bottom, like white to yellow or so, is hunting quality. So starting here in the beginning, 0 to 12 years after a clear cut, this is specifically during the summer. So you have an open canopy, which allows a lot of sunlight to reach the forest floor. So you have tons of forage availability, and like we covered before, you have great hunting quality. But as that stand progresses in that 12 to 25 years after a clear cut and that those trees begin to develop, you have a reduced forage availability, and hunting quality goes down pretty significantly because you no longer have that sightability of deer. Moving into the stem exclusion phase, you have a completely closed canopy, you have almost no forage, and again, poor hunting quality because there's just no deer using that cover type. And then finally, in old growth, you have kind of a moderately closed or open canopy, kind of moderate to high forage availability and moderate hunting quality. So there's deer there, but again, the sightability is not as great as if you were in a clear cut. So this is for summer characteristics of the trends in forest succession and deer behavior. As we move into winter, the stark difference here is really in this first 0 to 12 year time frame. So while in the summer you had great forage availability and high deer use, in the winter that habitat becomes pretty unusable if there's high snow loads. So there's no snow interception, and the snow accumulated on the ground can block out deer from either moving into that area or accessing forage if they can get it there. In that 12 to 25 years, as that young second growth stand stage, as that those trees are still pretty small, there's not a ton of snow interception, and again, low forage quality. In that second growth, stem exclusion phase, during the winter, there is some snow interception due to that closed canopy, but because you had no vegetation to start with, you have no vegetation in the winter. And then lastly, this old growth stage, where again, we're in that moderate area where there's good snow interception and moderate forage availability. So if we just kind of contrast these two things, there's pretty significant trade-offs in terms of these 0 to 12 years after a clear cut, where this provides excellent summer habitat, but very poor winter habitat. In contrast to this old growth stage where you might not be maximizing any one particular thing, but that type of stand is more resilient to changes. So as a forest, we're trying to transition this young growth stage quicker into these old growth characteristics. So amplifying that now into a landscape level or watershed scale, just to summarize here in the summer, we have deer kind of scattered throughout the alpine where they're finding, abundant forage in alpine meadows. And we also have deer in these recent clear cuts that are capitalizing on that new growth. But as snow falls in the alpine, those deer begin to move downslope into this old growth habitat. And then in those clear cuts, as snow starts to accumulate at lower elevations, those deer are also displaced into these old growth areas. So now we have a bunching of deer in these old growth habitats that can only support so many deer for so long during the winter. So the solutions on how to address kind of land management and deer restoration here are to establish travel corridors. So that might be leaf strips if you're harvesting an old growth stand, or it might be slash treatment to facilitate movement after a pre-commercial thin in a young growth stand. But several ways to create travel corridors. The idea is to facilitate elevational movement for those migratory deer. So being able to travel from winter range to summer range, but also kind of in mid to low range elevations, creating access to different forest patches to where deer can utilize that landscape during different times of the year. So this kind of addresses the movement and habitat connectivity component to managing deer. The other thing is to increase the carrying capacity to forage availability. And to do that, you can do thinning or gaps or different types of intermediary second growth treatments to open up that forest canopy, with the idea that this is generating more forage and increasing the overall carrying capacity of deer on the landscape. Some of the challenges to actually implementing this on the ground. The two questions that I think that are most relevant and the most difficult to answer is the where and the how questions. So where are these areas that we should prioritize and that are, can benefit the most from some intervention, and how do we do that based on those site specific characteristics? So we heard a great presentation about the sustainable Southeast Alaska Sustainability Strategy Forest Management project list that they released recently. So this provides a pretty good outline or framework to identify opportunities for where the Forest Service is planning to focus on for the next 10 years or so across the Tongass. Not to say that these are specifically where the habitat needs are greatest, but it does provide a really good forest level summary of where we can focus these habitat restoration efforts. As we heard just on the presentation before by Bob and KK, there is some really cool habitat mapping being done with LiDAR and other strategies to identify or to try to get a closer answer to this where question. Currently, the Forest Service uses 3 criteria to define what winter habitat is, deer winter habitat, and that is south-facing, high-productive old growth stands under 800 feet in elevation. And while this is a pretty basic general description of what qualifies as deer winter habitat, and is useful for large-scale land management decisions in terms of understanding what type of opportunities and what the need is on a forest level scale, this doesn't really provide any guidance for watershed level specific where within a stand or within a watershed we might need to do work where that benefits deer the most. And so there is the need to develop this watershed level assessment criteria to help account for these spatially explicit trends and forest characteristics and such. And Bob and KK's presentation highlighted the utility of this watershed level assessment really well. Moving on to the how, we had a great presentation yesterday by Kellen on the work through the Tongass-wide young growth studies, or TWIGs, and the impacts of various treatments on forage regeneration and the effects of those treatments in terms of timing on when they're being implemented. And other work being done about assessing the impacts of various second growth treatments. But generally, the challenge here is to find a balance based on site-specific conditions to help weight which one of these two things is the priority in that specific watershed. So that might be forage production versus snow interception. And those are the two things that you're trying to reach a balance for to provide good habitat year-round for deer. And generally, the literature is pretty well established on the vegetation response to these second growth treatments, partially due because plants don't move and they're easy to measure relatively to deer. So from the deer's perspective, there's not a ton of information on how deer are actually responding to these treatments. So there's a need for more deer monitoring. And as the Mueller Foundation starts to do work on the ground forest habitat restoration projects, one of the things that I'm wanting to emphasize from our perspective is being able to more closely monitor the direct impacts of our work and how the treatments or the on the ground work that we're doing, whether it is achieving our intended outcomes, which again is supporting conservation of deer and their habitat. And so we're still in the very early stages of developing a monitoring strategy for this, but this is just a general basic outline of where we're at this stage. So we got a little bit of seed money through SAF funding distributed from the Southeast Conference. And the idea is that we'll use cameras to generate a baseline of deer activity in stands that we intend to treat, represented here in the red rectangle here. So prior to doing work in an area, the idea is we'll take a year of baseline data on deer behavior. And then the idea is that we'll monitor both in the area that we're treating as well as immediately adjacent areas to see how deer are being displaced by that initial disturbance of the treatment. So understanding where deer go when we're implementing these treatments. And then after some time, usually in that like 3 to 5 year range, when forage starts to come back and deer start responding to that treatment, we'll be able to document that post-treatment effect, how deer are behaving in that landscape. But again, like I said, we're still at the very early stages of this. We're hoping to implement kind of a pilot study this year on some of the projects that we have outlined. And we're also working with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game as they transition their deer monitoring study to a camera-based method. So they've been doing pellet counts for like 40 years, but they're kind of abandoning that approach moving forward. They just completed a 3 or 4 year study on using cameras to monitor deer abundance and behavior region-wide. And so we're planning on using a lot of the same protocols so that we're able to contribute data to that project as well. And then just leaving kind of to close out here, one of the things that I think is really important to think about when we start trying to develop strategies of how to achieve these forest management goals along with wildlife restoration goals is the issue of scale. So both spatial and temporal scale. So when we think of spatial scale, from a deer's perspective, we're thinking like on the order of a couple hundred acres, maybe is the home range of a deer. There's a lot of variability in that, but generally speaking, a few hundred acres is about the home range of deer in Southeast. Contrast that with kind of the spatial scale that we're thinking of in terms of forest management, and we're on this, thousands to millions of acres in terms of how do we transition a complete forest into some of these forest management objectives. So, also thinking about the temporal scale. So from a deer's perspective, they reach sexual maturity around 2 years old. And the lifespan of a blacktail is about 10 years. And then again, contrast that with the temporal scale for a forest where to reach old growth characteristics after a clear cut, can take centuries. So thinking about this kind of mismatch in scales and how any forest intervention is probably going to be experienced by, potentially hundreds of generations of deer. When you start thinking about, these forest level manipulations, and how that's going to play out in the future for deer. So thank you again for the opportunity to talk, and I'm more than happy to talk about opportunities for collaboration or answer any questions. Sure. Yeah.
We got 3 minutes.
Yeah.
How do you incorporate the societal needs for harvests and then throw in some other predators, natural predators with your models? Because I'm glad you said they have a few hundred acres per year. Is there any intent or ability to control harvest on the national forest?
So I guess the way I understood the first part of that question was, how are we integrating or planning to integrate kind of hunter knowledge or local knowledge about important areas to manage deer? There is some work that Todd Brinkman had done maybe about 5 years ago, where he was doing focus group discussions with local communities and hunter surveys as part of a collaboration with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game to document areas important to hunters, and kind of use that local knowledge to guide areas we want to emphasize restoration in. We are talking with Todd and other researchers to kind of go back through and do that again. And so that community engagement and input is going to drive some of where we start to prioritize where we want to do work. Obviously, we have limited funds and we need to figure out the best places to spend that. So did that answer your question?
Yeah, kind of, you touched on it.
Okay.
I was just more thinking about, there's only so much carrying capacity.
Yeah.
And there's only so much ideal forest at the optimum stage. So I mean, if you create too much feeding area, then you really mess around with the carrying capacity.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. And that's, I think, part of.
That's a hard question.
Well, and that's kind of where we're at right now. The question is, there's this underlying assumption that increased forage means increased deer populations, but that's been largely untested. That's part of why we want to do this pre-post treatment monitoring and, start engaging more meaningfully with local communities and the Alaska Department of Fish and Game to see how deer populations are changing. But yeah, I mean, I think that is still an unanswerable question. Yeah. So. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for trying.
Yeah.
Thank you for all the way across the room. Scott, first, thank you. Second, your chart up there, we have home range. I'm assuming that's family group. And that's coming from my perspective of whitetail, not blacktail. I'm a transplant from whitetail territory. So I've always been curious about some of these differences. And two, you alluded to two different kind of seasonal patterns. So that leads me to ask, within that range, obviously we have this summer to winter range, but what's the fidelity of the group in there? Like with whitetail, you could they have a very high fidelity. They did not jump over lines very much. You can use that as a management tool in strategizing how to manage both your forest and your population. So wondering if there's anything similar with blacktail.
Yeah. So the first part of that question, home range size. So that like couple hundred acres was just like broad generalization. I think based on telemetry studies that have been done on Admiralty, that home range for an individual ranges from like 30 acres to like 1,200 acres. And that spread is due to, which kind of addresses the second part of that question. Some are migratory and some are resident. So, obviously a resident deer is gonna probably have a smaller home range than a migratory deer. And in terms of connecting those different seasonal ranges and their site fidelity, the thought that I've gathered, and I don't know whether or not somebody has a better answer for this, but the idea is that tendency for migration is a learned trait from the mother. So if a doe has a tendency to be a seasonal migrant, typically her offspring are going to be also seasonally migrants.
Like the rose petal theory.
Yeah.
Or a portion of the population.
Right, yeah. And I'm not sure whether or not there's good documentation about what proportion in the population are resident and migratory. And of course, that's probably going to change based on environmental conditions and things like that. So,
Thank you.
yeah.